Upon arrival at the residence, the deputies noticed that the front door was ajar. As they cautiously approached the house, their eyes were drawn to what appeared to be a person lying on the floor inside. They shouted verbal commands, but there was no response. It was then that a loud gunshot echoed through the air, signaling the beginning of a tragic and devastating event. Every parent has a specific vision for how they wish to raise their children. However, in the case of the Stockdale family of Beach City, Ohio, their bizarrely strict household rules might have directly contributed to the horrific massacre that claimed the lives of two innocent family members. This event, one that no one could have foreseen, remains shrouded in mystery, with the true motive behind the killings still unknown. The Stockdale family massacre stands as one of the most disturbing and perplexing cases in recent history, not just because of its brutality, but because of the eerie silence from the perpetrator. To this day, the killer, Jacob Stockdale, has not spoken about why he carried out the murders, leaving both investigators and the public in a state of shock and confusion. In this article, we will attempt to unravel the grim details of this tragedy, which starkly reveals how darkness can lurk beneath the surface of what appears to be an idyllic family life at its core. This case speaks to the psychological and emotional toll that an oppressive upbringing can take on an individual. The Stockdale family was known for their deeply religious beliefs and strict, almost suffocating rules. Tim and Kathy Stockdale were determined to raise their four sons Calvin, Charles, Jacob, and James with the highest moral standards. For them, this meant keeping their children isolated from the outside world, away from distractions like television, video games, and socializing with others outside their immediate family. In a secluded farmhouse in Beach City, Ohio, they attempted to shelter their children from what they saw as the negative influences of society. Kathy, in particular, was a highly authoritarian figure in the household. Her rules were rigid, often punishing the boys for minor infractions while offering minimal rewards for compliance. The Stockdale boys were expected to follow a strict routine, and their mother's disapproval of any deviation was met with severe consequences. The only small pleasures they were allowed were activities like listening to a carefully monitored radio show, a reward that came only after completing a long list of chores around the house and farm. In many ways, the Stockdale family's way of life seemed like something out of a bygone era. Kathy believed that leisure, even in the form of television, was sinful, and every day was carefully structured around work and religious devotion. They believed that the world outside their home was filled with dangers that would corrupt their children, and yet, despite the isolation, there was a dark undercurrent to their seemingly wholesome way of life. The family band, formed by the boys and their father, Tim, was one of the few outlets for joy in the Stockdale household. Jacob, the second youngest, showed exceptional talent as a fiddle player, and by the age of 7, he was already a prodigy. He won awards across Ohio, including the title of Ohio State Grand Fiddle Champion. In 2012, the family band performed regularly, with Calvin on the banjo, Charles on the mandolin, James on the upright bass, and Jacob on the fiddle. Tim, the patriarch, fronted the band with his guitar, and they performed at local events, garnering a modest following. However, the music was not enough to mask the tension that simmered within the family. Jacob's increasing discomfort with the strict confines of his upbringing became more apparent as he grew older. Unlike his brothers, who eventually moved away to pursue their own lives, Jacob remained at home. In many ways, he seemed trapped in a world that he didn't fully understand, his every move still dictated by his mother's unyielding rules. In 2008, the Stockdale family agreed to appear on the popular TV show Wife Swap, a reality show that aired on national television. The premise of the show was simple. Two families with vastly different lifestyles would swap wives for 2 weeks, allowing the audience to witness the resulting clashes between the families' contrasting ways of life. Little did Kathy Stockdale know that this decision would set in motion a series of events that would end in tragedy. The producers of Wife Swap were immediately drawn to the Stockdale family's strict, conservative way of life, and they also enlisted the Tonkovich family from Illinois, whose lifestyle couldn't have been more different. The Tonkoviches were a carefree, laid-back family who allowed their children to wake up whenever they wanted, eat whatever they pleased, and essentially live without any rules. When Lori Tonkovich swapped places with Kathy, she was shocked by the rigid and militaristic routine that the Stockdale boys were forced to follow. She was particularly appalled by the rules surrounding the boys' daily routines. If they didn't make it to the breakfast table within 4 minutes of waking up, they were fined 25 cents. Afterward, they would spend hours doing farm chores, earning tokens for completing tasks with a glad heart, which could then be exchanged for small rewards. Lori, in a bid to open the boys' eyes to the outside world, introduced them to television, video games, and other pleasures they had never experienced. Jacob, in particular, struggled with these new experiences. When Lori encouraged him to watch TV, he became distraught, fearing that watching it would send him to hell. This reaction hinted at the extent of the Stockdale family's isolation and indoctrination, where even innocent pleasures were viewed as morally corrupting. Jacob's resistance to these changes was a sign of how deeply the family's values had shaped him, and it also foreshadowed the deep psychological conflict that would later boil over into violence. As the Wife Swap episode came to a close, it was clear that neither Kathy nor Lori had been changed by the experience. Kathy remained resolute in her beliefs, unable to understand how anyone could live without the strict structure she had imposed on her children. Lori, on the other hand, left feeling heartbroken for the boys, knowing that they had been denied a normal childhood. Yet the show did little to break the cycle of control and isolation in the Stockdale family. Years passed, and the boys began to grow up and leave home. Calvin, the eldest, went off to college in Michigan, and Charles moved to Philadelphia to study medicine, yet Jacob and James remained at home, seemingly trapped in the same oppressive environment. By 2017, Jacob was 26 and James was 21, but neither had left their parents' house. The question of why they stayed has been a subject of much speculation, but there may have been something deeper at play, perhaps a sense of duty, fear, or confusion about life beyond the rigid structure of their upbringing. The Stockdale family band continued to perform without Calvin or Charles, but Jacob's life seemed increasingly detached from the world around him. His inner turmoil, compounded by years of isolation, had begun to fester. As the family's lifestyle continued unchanged, it was clear that the cracks in Jacob's psyche were widening. On the afternoon of June 15th, 2017, the quiet town of Beach City, Ohio, was shattered by a horrifying act of violence that would leave the community grappling for answers. Jacob Stockdale, a young man in his mid-20s, stood at the center of a tragedy so unimaginable that its ripples would affect not just his family, but everyone who heard about it. At first glance, Jacob's life seemed to follow a predictable and almost serene routine. He lived on a secluded farm with his parents, Tim and Kathy, and his younger brother James. From the outside, the Stockdale family appeared to be an idyllic example of a close-knit, religious household. They were a family of musicians, dedicated to their faith, and lived in a way that seemed to embody the values of self-discipline and family unity. Yet, behind the closed doors of their isolated farmhouse, there was a growing sense of turmoil, an undercurrent of tension that no one could quite name. The rules were strict, oppressive even. Kathy, the mother, had long imposed a rigid, almost military-like structure on her children's lives. Every aspect of their existence was controlled. Their work on the farm, their education, even their interactions with the outside world. The boys were never allowed to watch TV, play video games, or make friends outside the family. Jacob, in particular, seemed to be struggling under the weight of this strict regimen, while his older brothers, Calvin and Charles, eventually left home to pursue their own lives, seeking freedom in distant cities. Jacob and James remained in the farmhouse, seemingly tethered to a life they could not escape. But why did Jacob stay? Why, at the age of 26, did he continue to live under the stifling control of his mother? Was it out of duty, fear, or perhaps something deeper, an inability to break free from the psychological grip of a controlling household? For years, Jacob's existence had been a paradox. To the outside world, he appeared normal. He was a talented fiddle player, part of the family band that performed across Ohio. He showed no outward signs of aggression or distress, but the internal pressures must have been immense. His mother's unwavering beliefs, her obsessive control over every detail of their lives, must have created an invisible pressure that was slowly building, ready to explode. As the Stockdale story unfolded in public after their appearance on the reality TV show Wife Swap in 2008, it became clear that Jacob's family life was not only restrictive, but also profoundly isolating. The moment that reality TV producers brought in Lori Takovich, a mother from a completely different world, one her children were free to explore, socialize, and make their own decisions, the contrast was stark. Lori was shocked by the rigid schedule and the overwhelming control Kathy had over her children's lives. The boys, especially Jacob, seemed so detached from anything resembling normal childhood joy. Something as simple as watching TV or playing video games was an alien concept to them. What Lori didn't know, however, was that her time with the Stockdale family would only serve to highlight the deep fissures within the household and to set into motion a series of events that would ultimately culminate in the devastating massacre of Kathy and James. On that fateful day, Jacob had reached his breaking point. The constraints of his upbringing, the oppressive atmosphere of the farm, and the unrelenting expectations placed upon him had slowly corroded his mental state. His seemingly normal life filled with music and routine was a facade, masking the emotional turmoil building within him. The gunshot heard by police officers as they arrived at the Stockdale residence was not just the sound of violence, but the final breaking of a man pushed to the edge. What could drive a young man like Jacob, once a child prodigy, to turn on the very people who had shaped his life? Was it a simple moment of madness, or was it the culmination of years of psychological torment, isolation, and a mother's oppressive love? The answers were not immediately clear. What was known, however, was that on that day, Jacob did something irreversible, something that would forever change his family, his future, and the course of his life. As Jacob entered his mid-20s, the tension within the Stockdale family reached a boiling point. While his older brothers, Calvin and Charles, had long since left the family home, seeking lives independent from their parents' strict rules, Jacob and James remained at the farm, seemingly trapped by a web of expectations and obligations that they couldn't escape. There was an undeniable sense of quiet desperation in the air, a feeling that perhaps the walls of the small farmhouse, with its meticulously maintained gardens and neatly arranged rooms, were slowly closing in on them. Jacob's decision to stay behind, despite his age when all logic would suggest he should have left, remains one of the more perplexing aspects of the tragedy that unfolded in June 2017. Why had Jacob stayed? Was it love for his family, or was it something more sinister, a deep-seated fear and resentment growing in the shadows? Had the pressures of living under his mother's suffocating rules finally driven him to the edge? Perhaps Jacob was never truly free to begin with, his life always revolving around his mother's controlling influence. Unlike Calvin, who pursued his studies at Hillsdale College in Michigan, or Charles, who moved to Philadelphia to become a medical student, Jacob seemed to have little direction of his own. In the small, isolated world that his parents had created, Jacob had little chance to experience the life his peers were leading. He was removed from the distractions and temptations of the outside world, and in his mother's eyes, this was for his own good. No dating, no friends outside the family, and certainly no indulgence in the pleasures of popular culture. The family had strict rules in place, rules that governed every waking moment. Even something as simple as enjoying a TV show or playing video games was seen as morally questionable. The thought of such wasted time was enough to send his mother into a moral frenzy, urging Jacob and his brothers to focus solely on productive activities, often tied to their Christian beliefs or farm work. Jacob's life was not that of a typical 20-something. Instead of attending college or forming lasting relationships with people his age, Jacob's world was confined to the tiny, isolated farm in Beach City, Ohio. His mother's obsession with a strict schedule controlled every aspect of his existence. Wake up early, perform chores, study at home. Everything was dictated. As Jacob grew older, it became increasingly clear that his mother's idealized vision of family life was no longer enough to keep him happy. He longed for something more, something that would allow him to escape the rigid confines of the life he had known. But every time he attempted to break free, whether through participating in the wife swap show or by pursuing his own passions in music, he found himself pulled back into the same cycle of control and restriction. The murder of Kathy and James, while shocking, was not a complete surprise to those who had been paying attention to the signs of distress within the family. Behind the smiles and the family band performances, there was a deep and growing darkness that no one outside of the family truly understood. Jacob had lived a life of isolation, under the thumb of a mother who believed that fun was sinful and that only hard work and spiritual devotion had value. The lack of freedom weighed heavily on Jacob, and by 2017, that weight had become unbearable. Jacob's sense of self was fractured. He had never been given the chance to make decisions for himself. Every choice had been preordained by his mother. It is perhaps in this context that we begin to understand the deadly spiral that led to the Stockdale family massacre. On the surface, Jacob was just another young man struggling to find his way in the world. But in the darkness of his mind, he was dealing with something far more profound, a sense of being trapped, a desire for release, and an overwhelming need to escape. The tension was palpable, and Jacob was living on a knife's edge. His father, Tim, while loving, was largely absent from the day-to-day decisions that shaped the family dynamic. Tim's unquestioning support of Kathy's rules gave her unchecked authority over the household. This left Jacob with no one to turn to for help or support. He was isolated, not only from his peers, but also from any semblance of emotional freedom or independence. The closest thing he had to an outlet was his music. Music was something that connected him to the outside world, but even in the band, there was no escape from the stifling presence of his parents. It was clear that Jacob's relationship with his mother had become increasingly strained. The family band, while providing a sense of unity, was also a reminder of the rigid control she maintained over every aspect of their lives. The songs they played, the way they performed, even the themes of the music were carefully chosen to reflect their deeply Christian values. It was a way of expressing themselves, but it was also a way of keeping themselves within the bounds of the family's beliefs. As Jacob's life continued to stagnate, he began to show signs of emotional and psychological distress. The pressure mounted, and his mental state began to deteriorate. While his older brothers were able to build lives of their own, Jacob was still living in the same small world, surrounded by the same rules, the same oppressive atmosphere that had existed for as long as he could remember. For Jacob, every day was a reminder that he was still his mother's child, still under her control, still subject to her authority. And yet something shifted in 2017. The events that unfolded that fateful June day were not merely the result of a single moment of madness. They were the culmination of years of repression, years of emotional torment, and years of living in an environment that stifled Jacob's ability to express himself. His family had given him no room to grow, no chance to form his own identity. This lack of freedom, combined with the constant pressure to live up to his mother's expectations, created a volatile mix. The day Jacob finally snapped, the day he turned the gun on his mother and brother, was the breaking point of a long, painful journey. What happened that day in the Stockdale home was not just a senseless act of violence. It was the result of years of emotional neglect, psychological manipulation, and a family structure that, while seemingly well-meaning, ultimately destroyed its members from the inside out. The police response to the 911 call that came from the Stockdale residence only deepened the mystery. When they arrived, they found Jacob barely alive, with a gunshot wound to the head. The presence of the firearm next to him suggested that it had been a suicide attempt gone wrong. But as they ventured further into the house, they discovered the grisly truth. Kathy and James were dead, their bodies riddled with shotgun pellets. What had led Jacob to this moment? What had pushed him to such a breaking point? These questions lingered long after the initial shock of the murders had passed. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that there was more to the Stockdale family's story than anyone had realized. And even though Jacob had survived his suicide attempt, the truth behind his actions remained elusive, buried deep in the complexities of his upbringing and his internal struggle for identity and freedom. His mental state, already fragile, would become even more complicated as the trial approached, leaving everyone, family, law enforcement, and the public alike wondering if they would ever truly understand what had driven him to murder his mother and brother. The increasing tension in Jacob's life, by all accounts, appeared to be a contradiction. A young man in his mid-20s, seemingly still attached to a childhood that had been shaped entirely by his parents' rigid, often suffocating rules. Despite his musical talents and accolades, he had always been under the shadow of a family dynamic that left little room for personal freedom. To outsiders, Jacob appeared to be the golden child, the prodigy, the one who had mastered the fiddle before hitting puberty. But beneath the surface, the cracks in his psyche were beginning to show. He may have smiled at family performances, his fingers expertly gliding across the strings of his fiddle, but inside, his world was unraveling. The strict routines, the obsessive regulations, and the endless teachings of his mother had suffocated him. He had no room to think for himself, let alone make his own decisions. It was as if the world outside of the Stockdale household did not exist. The radio, the small family band, the homeschooling, all of it reinforced a sense of isolation that, over time, had turned from something that felt comforting into something unbearable. And, despite the fact that the band was still performing, even recording albums, Jacob could not shake the feeling that he was being held prisoner by the very people who had once been his greatest supporters. The other brothers, Calvin and Charles, had long since left home. They had broken free, found their own paths in life, but Jacob remained stuck, trapped in a small house on a remote farm in Beach City. Even his brother James, although still living with the family, had aspirations of his own. James was attending a nearby university, pursuing a business degree, but Jacob, he seemed lost, without any clear direction. His music was his only refuge, but even that was a reminder of his entrapment. His brothers had found their paths, while Jacob seemed to be stuck in an endless loop, unable to break free of the expectations placed upon him by his mother. A dangerous escalation, but things were not always so tense. There was a time when the Stockdale family's life, though strict, seemed to have a semblance of harmony. There was music, there was faith, and there was a sense of unity, at least, on the surface. But over the years, the rigidity of the Stockdale household began to wear on Jacob. As his brothers moved on with their lives, Jacob began to feel the weight of his isolation. It wasn't just the fact that he was still living with his parents. It was the way his entire existence had been dictated. Jacob wasn't allowed to make any decisions for himself. Everything was decided for him. From what he ate to when he worked and how he spent his free time, the more Jacob tried to express his discomfort, the more Kathy reinforced the rules. She truly believed that her strict regimen was the only path to salvation and righteousness. Anything less, in her eyes, was sinful leisure, pleasure, and fun were seen as distractions, dangerous distractions. So Jacob's music, once a source of joy, became another thing he was expected to do for the family's image. It was not something he did for his own love of music, but rather as another form of duty, another way to meet expectations. The tragic irony was that Jacob's talent for music, something that could have been his escape, had been co-opted by the very system that sought to trap him. Music became another form of control. And while Jacob had earned accolades and recognition, there was no personal satisfaction in it. Every note he played, every award he won, was tied to his mother's approval. It wasn't his music anymore. It was her vision of what he should be. This realization must have been suffocating. The wife swap incident, the infamous wife swap incident, which initially seemed like it might be a turning point for the Stockdale family, only highlighted the depth of the control his parents had over him. Jacob's mother, Kathy, was proud of her strict rules, but when she swapped places with Lori Tonkovich, she was forced to confront the reality of how oppressive her system truly was. The Tonkovich family, living in Illinois, was everything the Stockdales weren't: chaotic, disorganized, and free. When Lori stepped into the Stockdale household, she was horrified by the regimented routine the boys had to follow. From waking up at 7:30 a.m. to the constant chores and homeschooling, it was a life of strict discipline where every minute was accounted for. The shock for Kathy came when Lori introduced the boys to the concept of fun, something that was almost non-existent in the Stockdale household. Lori brought in a cable TV and a video game console, both of which the boys had never been allowed to experience. For the first time in their lives, they were allowed to engage in activities just for fun. But for Jacob, this small act of kindness was overwhelming. When Lori encouraged him to watch TV, Jacob broke down in tears. He was terrified that by indulging in something as worldly as television, he might be damned. It was a heartbreaking moment, one that revealed the depth of his indoctrination and the extent to which his mother's rules had shaped his worldview. As much as Lori tried to show the boys another way of life, Jacob's fear and confusion remained. He had been so deeply entrenched in the belief system his mother had instilled in him that he could not fathom a life outside of it. Lori's attempts to offer him an alternative to his life of endless labor and strict obedience only seemed to reinforce how far gone Jacob's mind had become. Even when she bought them video games, Jacob's guilt was overwhelming. For him, pleasure was a sin, and no matter how hard Lori tried to convince him otherwise, his fears were too deeply rooted. As the investigation into the Stockdale family massacre continued, authorities were left grappling with the question that loomed over the entire tragedy. What had driven Jacob to such an unimaginable act? The Stockdale family, once known for their tightly knit bond and religious devotion, had now become the focus of widespread speculation. Theories began to circulate, each trying to make sense of the unthinkable. Tim Stockdale, the father, remained inconsolable. Though he had not been present at the time of the killings, the weight of the horror crushed him. His once peaceful, orderly world had been torn apart, and now he was forced to confront the truth about his sons and his own role in the family's unrelenting rules. Could it be that his insistence on strict religious discipline and regimented routines had created a pressure cooker environment, a world where rebellion wasn't an option and escape wasn't even imaginable? Meanwhile, Calvin Stockdale, the eldest son, had distanced himself from the family years before. After graduating from Hillsdale College in Michigan, he had chosen to live far away, seeking to free himself from his parents' control. His decision to break away appeared to be the first sign of any of the Stockdale children attempting to carve out their own paths in the aftermath of the massacre. Calvin, along with his younger brother Charles, who had left for Philadelphia to pursue medical school, were forced to face the painful reality that their own family might not have been as idyllic as they had once believed. The remaining sons, Jacob and James, had stayed behind. James, a bright young man with dreams of running the family band, had found himself trapped in a world of extreme isolation. Though he was still in college and studying business, he had little contact with peers outside his immediate family. The strict nature of their household meant that James, like Jacob, had been deprived of normal social experiences. Yet, while James was determined to find some form of normalcy, Jacob seemed to be slowly unraveling. Jacob's childhood, while outwardly productive, filled with farm chores, music practice, and family performances, had been dominated by his mother's obsessive need for control. As the years passed, Jacob grew increasingly withdrawn, haunted by doubts about his own existence and the suffocating grip his mother had over his life. His love for music, a gift that had earned him recognition across Ohio, seemed like a fleeting escape from the rigidity of his home life. But even this passion had not been enough to free him from the mental prison that his upbringing had created. It was only after the tragic events of June 15, 2017, that the full extent of Jacob's internal torment would begin to come to light. Following the grisly discovery of his family's bodies, police investigators began to delve deeper into Jacob's psychological state. The shotgun wound to his head suggested that he may have attempted suicide after killing his mother and brother. But was it a genuine attempt to end his own life, or had it been an impulsive act of guilt? Authorities were still unsure. One thing was clear, though: Jacob's actions were not driven by a sudden burst of rage. The signs of mental anguish, long suppressed by years of rigid control and isolation, had been building for a long time. Jacob had struggled with the concept of free will, torn between a desire for escape and an ingrained sense of guilt instilled by his mother. Even in his darkest moments, he feared the consequences of his actions. He had feared going to hell. Meanwhile, the local community, once enamored with the Stockdale family's wholesome image, found itself in shock. How could a family so deeply rooted in religious values, a family that seemed so perfect on the surface, descend into such violence? The answer lay in the complex web of control, love, and fear that had governed the family dynamics for years. Many would point to Kathy Stockdale's strictness as the key factor in her son's eventual breakdown. As Jacob's life hung in the balance, both the public and the authorities were left to wonder, Had he simply snapped under the unbearable pressure of a lifetime of emotional and mental strain? Or had the family's unyielding structure played a deeper role in the devastating outcome? The investigation into the Stockdale family massacre was nothing short of a painstaking ordeal. While Jacob lay in a critical condition in the hospital, the Stark County Police began their work at the crime scene, attempting to piece together the chaotic events that had unfolded within the Stockdale household. The house, once a seemingly idyllic farm where the family lived by strict religious principles, now stood as a chilling reminder of how even the most controlled environments can harbor deep, unspoken violence. As law enforcement officers scoured the property, they couldn't ignore the eerie sense of silence that enveloped the home. Kathy, once the authoritative figure who maintained an iron grip over the family's daily life, now lay lifeless on the floor, a victim of her own son's wrath. James, the youngest of the boys, was found in a similar state, his body riddled with shotgun pellets. The brutal murders left everyone wondering, what could have driven Jacob to this unspeakable act of violence? At first, there were no clear answers. Jacob's condition was critical, and investigators faced the challenge of trying to understand the motive behind the massacre. Tim, the patriarch of the family, was still struggling to come to terms with the brutal loss of his wife and youngest son. Despite his grief, he had to cooperate with the investigation, and his statements about the tragedy were carefully scrutinized. Tim's words were measured, as he avoided directly commenting on Jacob's involvement, perhaps in an attempt to shield the remaining family members from the media's relentless inquiries. Jacob's life, it seemed, had been nothing like that of a typical young man. The sense of restriction and control under which he grew up left little room for exploration or personal development. A significant part of the investigation revolved around the question of how a young man, seemingly so close to his family, could commit such a violent act. Law enforcement sought to understand the dynamics of the Stockdale household. Was Jacob's decision to stay home at the age of 26 indicative of a deeper struggle, or was he simply a victim of an environment that stifled his sense of self? The tight-knit family was now left to confront the brutal reality of what had happened. The community in Beach City, Ohio, was in shock, unable to reconcile the image of the once pious and hard-working family with the bloodshed that had taken place under their roof. Investigators combed through the family's history, looking for any signs of abuse or dysfunction that might have led to this catastrophic event. In the midst of the grief, the police turned their attention to the surviving son Jacob as the sole suspect. Jacob's state of mind was of utmost importance. He had survived the gunshot wound he inflicted on himself, but whether he would ever be fit to stand trial was uncertain. Doctors and psychologists were called in to assess his mental state, and their conclusions would ultimately shape the course of the investigation. Was Jacob simply a broken man, a product of years of emotional and psychological turmoil, or was he a calculated killer, one who had been plotting this act of violence for years, waiting for the right moment to strike? The investigation was a delicate process. Stark County's law enforcement officers were careful to avoid jumping to conclusions. There was no immediate indication that Jacob had been suffering from any diagnosed mental illness. Still, the way he had been raised, isolated from the world and steeped in a rigid, unyielding environment, made it increasingly likely that psychological issues had played a major role in his violent outburst. Meanwhile, the police continued to gather evidence. Interviews with neighbors, friends, and extended family members revealed startling insights into Jacob's life. Many reported that they had never noticed any signs of violence or aggression in him. He had always seemed quiet, polite, and reserved, traits that often masked the deep turmoil he carried inside. Some even recalled how Jacob had appeared to be a gentle soul, someone who had an affinity for music and a passion for his family band. However, as investigators dug deeper, they began to see a darker side of Jacob. He had shown signs of deep depression in the years leading up to the massacre, and there were whispers of internal family conflict that had never been addressed. The most chilling revelation came when police discovered a journal belonging to Jacob. The journal contained pages upon pages of thoughts and reflections, some of which were disturbing. It was clear that Jacob had been struggling with his identity and had been questioning the very foundation of the life his family had forced upon him. But the most haunting part of Jacob's journal was his growing sense of guilt and resentment. He wrote about the pressure of living up to his mother's impossible standards, about the weight of carrying the family legacy, and about the deep, unspoken fear that he might never be able to escape the control that had defined his existence. Jacob's final entry, written just days before the massacre, was a cryptic and ominous passage. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever be free, if I'll ever be able to breathe without feeling guilty. I don't want to be the person they expect me to be anymore. Maybe the only way to find peace is to make them understand what it's like to be me." The entry sent shivers down the spines of the investigators. Was this the moment Jacob had snapped? Had he been planning the murders for weeks, or was it a spur-of-the-moment decision driven by years of emotional repression and psychological torment? The question of motive remained elusive. Some speculated that Jacob's sense of guilt and internalized shame had finally pushed him over the edge. Others believed that Jacob had been driven by a desire for freedom, and that killing his family was his only way out. The fact that he had spared his father, Tim, who had been away from the house at the time of the killings, added another layer of mystery to the case. Was Jacob's choice of victims symbolic? Did he target those who he felt represented the most oppressive aspects of his life? Or was it purely a matter of convenience? As the investigation progressed, the search for answers became a race against time. The police needed to determine not just why Jacob had committed the murders, but also how they could prevent such a tragedy from happening again. The tragic loss of Kathy and James Stockdale had left the family shattered, and the residents of Beach City were left grappling with the aftermath of an unimaginable act of violence.